Hello and welcome to It's a Match, Attracting Your Ideal Client webinar. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Jasmine Holmes. I am the owner of 910 West, a digital marketing firm specializing in small businesses. We'll learn a little bit more about specifically which type of small businesses we work with as we go through this presentation, because I will use our own ideal clients as examples as we go through here, illustrations for how to work through this process. I do have 15 plus 6 years experience in marketing, both digital and traditional. So I've worked on all ends of the spectrum. I've worked on websites, social media, as well as print campaigns, mailers, and advertising. And that does bring a fresh perspective because I really understand the importance of how foundational principles and how important those are to success in any type of marketing. And really at the end of the day, whether you're talking digital or traditional, it's more about tactics, and it's those core strategic pieces that, unless you have them in place, are going to hinder your success. So it's really those foundations that are important to marketing success, and knowing your ideal client, being really clear about your ideal client as one of those cornerstone pieces that is key to a strong marketing foundation. But you don't want an ideal client. And wait, I know you're thinking, what? I thought this whole webinar was about ideal clients. Why would you start with that? Well, let me explain. And really why I want to explain is because I get a lot of pushback when I introduce this concept with my clients, this idea of narrowing your focus, going really narrow, really specific. And there's a couple of reasons why. This is something that doesn't feel natural to us and feels a little bit counterintuitive. One of which is the maturity of the business. And so for a lot of folks listening to this, you probably are a little bit more established, but for those of you that are in your first, particularly 1 to 3 years, you're still figuring a lot of stuff out. And that's one of the reasons we really specialize. One of our ideal client criteria is that it's a business that's a little bit more established, because they have much more clarity about their services and what they're doing, about their branding. And so very early in the business, it can be hard to be very, very specific because the bottom line is you just don't know. And you don't have enough experience in the marketplace to really know what's going to work or not. So that's one of the reasons we do recommend for very young businesses that you do a lot of your marketing yourself, because you learn and you grow and you expand. And as you gain that maturity, you gain clarity. And that's where you're then able to start understanding what's worked, what not, and start narrowing down that focus. So the age of the business, younger business, is a little bit harder to be very specific because you still are kind of figuring things out. Your business identity. And what I mean by that is really understanding who you are, what you do for people, and what that comes back to is the bigger cause, which is fear. We're very afraid of what we might be missing out on, what we might be leaving on the table. But if I just focus on this one person, what about all these other people? I'm going to miss out on all this business. That is a great mindset for larger companies because they have the resources to be able to customize and appeal to multiple audiences. But for small businesses, it's actually doesn't work very well and is not at all efficient, because we don't have the budgets and the resources to be able to create multiple messages that go out on multiple platforms. So we end up creating a very generic message trying to appeal to as many people as possible. And it's that old, jack of all trades, master of none adage, which is by trying to appeal to this broad audience, you really come off very generic and you appeal to no one at all. And so it's overcoming that fear and understanding that this is actually going to unlock a success and getting comfortable with that concept, and sticking with that instead of kind of knee-jerk reaction. So take a step back, really look at it for what it is, and understand, because I've worked with many businesses myself as well as many other very talented marketing people, and this is a technique that we 100% know that works, and so trust in that process a little bit. More is not better. I know we live in a time, a society where we're very more driven. Amazon has trained us that we can have thousands of products to choose from and have them delivered to us at the drop of a hat. So we feel like more is always more. And for small businesses, that is really not true because we do have limited resources. We only have a certain number of people. We have smaller budgets. By focusing down, less is actually more for us. We're able to get much more out of what we do without having to expend those same resources. So we're much more efficient. Don't take my word for it. This gentleman here, his name is Michael Katz. He is the owner and principal at Blue Penguin Development, a company that specializes in email newsletter for solo professionals. So again, you can see very, very specific and incredibly successful. So let me play this video because he's got a great perspective that I'd love to share with you before we dive further into this conversation.
Hi, I'm Michael Katz. I have to admit, I'm feeling a little bit depressed today. You see, People magazine just came out with its list of the 50 most beautiful people on Earth. And once again, I am not on it. But what if instead they came out with an edition of the 50 most beautiful men in Eastern Massachusetts? Still wouldn't make it. What if they did one on the 50 most beautiful, bald, middle-aged men named Michael in my office? I'd win. I think you can see what I'm getting at. There's two ways to get to the top of a list. Work harder or narrow the field. You see, in my experience, most solo professionals spend most of their time trying to stand out by proving they're better. Much harder. What I think works better is to define yourself more narrowly. Don't be a coach. Be a coach who specializes in helping people with a chronic illness continue working.
Now I'm going to pause that video there because that's really the main point. Our key takeaway with that is when you narrow, you focus, you rise to the top. When you stay broad, you fall back into the anonymous path. And this is absolutely true. Michael says it, I say it, a lot of very smart marketing people say it. It's a very intuitive concept when you really start living this. The more narrow you can be in your business, particularly for small businesses, the more successful you will be. Because again, you don't have to compete on such a broad level, and you can make really specific messaging that's going to appeal very targeted to your one-on-one audience. So it's that idea of go narrow and rise to the top. So that narrow focus, what that's going to do for you, despite what we think that it's going to bring us less, it really is going to bring you more money because you're able to focus your efforts and work really in your zone of genius where you're strongest. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about as we work through this process. Is part of this conversation around the ideal client is really what is the type of work or what product do you offer that it really is your strength that you do better than anybody else, because that plays into who you offer that to, and you want to match up the ideal client to your strengths. When that happens, that's really where this focus kind of comes in and explodes, and where you do see that incredible profitability and you get the flexibility because one, you're doing the kind of work that you really, really love, and you're doing it for the people that you really love working with. And those two things together are magical. All of a sudden, what seems like a drudge in waking up every day to the small business becomes much more enjoyable and leads to the end goal, which is a lot more happiness in your business as well as in your personal life. So gyms are a perfect example. I don't know if you've noticed, but I have been fascinated over the last 18 months, 2 years, by the number of small gyms popping up, particularly CrossFit gyms. They're the most noticeable, but I've seen ballet bar gyms, I've seen yoga studios, I've seen cycle studios, all these really specialty gyms opening up really everywhere around me. And it kind of gives me pause because I've had a gym membership myself pretty much for as long as I can remember. And one of the things I've noticed about the larger gyms when I go in is it seems like they're struggling a lot. A lot of the facilities are not as nice or as upgraded as they used to be. They're definitely not as full as they used to be. And you don't see as many of those bigger gyms like the Golds, like a 24-hour or a Lifetime Fitness opening up anymore. And so it was kind of interesting to me to see this sort of boon over the last couple of years of all these little gyms opening, because if the big guys are struggling, why would all these little guys be jumping into the space? And that is the perfect example of going narrow. So think about how expensive it is to run one of those big gyms, all of the resources involved with that. You've got the square footage. They're huge. They're like the size of a grocery store. And for anybody who knows commercial real estate, you pay per square foot. So just paying for that property is costing you a pretty penny every month. On top of that, you've got staff to run the place because you can't just have it be unpopulated. You got to have people keeping an eye on what's going on. And you've got all that equipment. You've got all those ellipticals and treadmills lined up in a row, whether or not they're being used. So once you look at just that base investment to open your doors and keep them open for the equipment, for the staff, for the space, your overhead is enormous. And so with gyms, they struggle very hard because memberships, they need a huge number just to keep the doors open. And a lot of times the membership fees aren't enough, which is one of the reasons that they've gone into personal training to help boost that income and help cover that cost. And so it's this more is more is more, which is a bit of a vicious cycle. Because now, in addition to attract more people, they've got to bring more features in. So, oh, we've got a yoga class, but we have people who want Pilates too. So now we need to open a Pilates class. So we have to hire a Pilates instructor, and we have people who want to do CrossFit. So we got to put in this specialized CrossFit equipment. And now all of a sudden it's kind of spiraling out of control. And it's a little bit of a self-sustaining prophecy in terms that to grow bigger, to get the numbers that you need to keep the doors open, you have to offer more features and amenities, which increases your cost. And so you're kind of running in this constant cycle, more and more and more, to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. Whereas if you follow the examples of their smaller competitors, take a step back and take a look at what sorts of activities are people really, really into. So a yoga studio or a CrossFit gym is a great example of you don't need a lot of space, particularly with the CrossFit gyms, and you don't need a ton of equipment because they are very kind of minimalistic and pared down. So there's a couple of ropes attached to the wall and some tires and a set of weights and you're good to go. The other thing that CrossFit gyms do that's brilliant is they're only open at certain times. You come for classes, so that cuts way down on your staffing. So now you're spending a lot less money on your equipment, on your staff, and your space. And because it's something that is of great interest to people, you've got a very focused audience. So now you've gone much, much smaller. But for the people who love CrossFit, I don't know if anybody here has friends who are into CrossFit. Those folks are crazy for CrossFit. And so you've got this really sort of passionate audience that's going to be drawn into your studio, and you're spending a lot less money. So you don't have to work as hard to attract those people as well as to keep them happy. And that's really the perfect marriage. And so that's the example that I give of looking at gyms where you can go small and be successful and make really good money, but you have to be very focused about what it is you're going to do and really understand who those consumers are and make sure that the offering you build attracts to them. So as CrossFit, the interest in it begins to fade, those people might need to relook at their business plans and maybe tweak what they're offering or make sure they keep that core audience happy. But that's one of those things that just kind of happen right place at the right time, matching where they're able to go much smaller and be much more successful. And I think we'll only continue to see that trend increase because we're finding that people are getting very activity specific. So they want to go to a gym for that specific activity. So I think we'll continue to see those smaller guys flourish while the bigger guys struggle. So hopefully I've sold you on the idea of why you need an ideal client, why it's so important to your business, and really why it's going to take you to that level of success. It's probably left you wondering how, however, because while I've sold you on a really great principle, it's sort of, you've got a lot of fuzziness, just like our people here, about what does that really mean? How do I start identifying the ideal clients? Well, the good news is you already know some. And it really, you start with, it's all in who you know. I guarantee that in your client roster, you have at least one that is your ideal already. And so we just need to start by discovering who that person is. And once we've discovered that, we'll walk through the process of being able to generate more of those people. So start by asking yourself, what's your superpower? So I'm going to take a step back because, like I said, we know we already have this person in our business, but first we really want to be clear about what we do really well. And I've mentioned this in this presentation earlier. And what that means is we want to make sure that the thing that we do really well is appropriate to our audience. And if there's a mismatch there, we either need to look at, what we do really well, is there a way we can shift it to make it a better fit, or maybe we need to look at a different ideal client, a different market segment. And so those two things are really a push-play. So having clarity about what it is that you do really well plays into this discussion, because you can make sure that when you're deciding who your ideal client is and you begin attracting those people, that they're the right sorts of people, because you're doing the work that you want to do. Because what we don't want to do is build a highly successful business doing something that you hate doing every day. So get really clear about your superpower. This next step is the key, and it's super dead simple. Who's your favorite client? When I ask that question, that first name that pops in your head, write that down right now. Put it down on a piece of paper, because that's the person we're going to build off. Who's that client that every time the phone rings, you take their call because you enjoy talking to them so much? You love going to visit them because you have such a pleasant conversation. They get what you do. They really appreciate the work that you do for them. All those things that makes it so enjoyable. Their personalities, they mesh perfectly with you. You guys just got a simpatico. That's what we want in an ideal client. And so think of the client on your roster right now that's your favorite. Who is that person? Because that's going to be the key to working through this process and discovering and really being able to use this ideal client concept to market your business, is being able to describe them further, and having a visual of an actual person in your mind is the key to that, or a company. And so start by writing down who's your favorite client. And think also about who's not. And what I mean by that is there are some of those clients or customers that are a drain on resources. Either they're just exhausting to deal with because our personalities are not a good match for each other, or they don't quite understand what we do, so there's a lot of questioning and explaining that has to happen. So for a lot of reasons, they may just not be a good fit. Think about those people and the characteristics or the things that really make them not as pleasant to work with as your favorite, because we can take that and flip that on its head and take those same characteristics that are a bit of a negative that don't work for us, and say, well, what would be the flip side of that coin? If it's because they don't understand what we do, maybe because they're very not technologically savvy, then we know that we want customers that are technologically savvy, because then we don't have to spend that time on the education and they really get what we do. So that can also help you get some clarity as we work through the next step, which is really coming up with the description and being able to paint a picture of what that ideal client looks like. So if you haven't already, take a minute, pause this video, write down the name of your favorite client in the center of a sheet of paper. Now that we have that favorite client in mind, let's begin crafting the identity. So this is where we want to be very descriptive about who this person is. And from a business-to-business standpoint, there's actually going to be two elements, and this is going to be a little bit different for companies that work directly with other companies versus companies that work directly with the public, with consumers. Because for your business-to-business folks, we need to think about the types of businesses, so the organizations, as well as the individuals within them. Because the company characteristics will play into what makes them ideal. Like I mentioned earlier, we prefer to, and our ideal client is a little bit more established business. And so that is something that we need to keep in mind, because we can describe the perfect business owner, but if they're in a brand new business enterprise, they still may not be the right fit for us just because the business is not ready. So that is one thing that's a little bit different, and I will talk about this process from both of those angles, but describing the company is something that will be important to a business-to-business business versus somebody who's working directly with consumers. And the reason I have this picture here with our peanuts and then the peanuts in the pod is because at the end of the day, even though we are looking to describe that higher level business or organization, it's the people within that we're making the connections with. So even though we do want to put some thought in what that organization looks like, we really need to be able to describe the individual who would be the person that would be the one to hire us, or that would be the decision maker for the product or service that we offer. And for consumers, it's all about that peanut in the pod, that gold little peanut sitting in right there. We need to be able to describe in detail what that person looks like. And this is not a mental picture. So I said painting a picture a little bit a while ago. This is not something that you carry around in your head. We can start that way. You can start with your mental picture. Hopefully you're already picturing your favorite client right now, but we need to write this down. It needs to be written down in a very deliberate way. I'm going to walk you through, as we go through the rest of this process, the worksheet and the form that we use for this, which is our ideal client profile. And at the end of this, you'll be able to download the workbook that walks you through this process and includes those in a PowerPoint format where you'll be able to fill that in. And those client profiles, we'll talk about how to use them, but really do need to be posted and used in a very public and visible way within your company, because it's something that you need to be looking at a lot, and always keep your ideal client in mind. And one of the best ways to do that is to have a physical reminder. So not just that mental reminder, because that's easy to put to the side. We get a million other things going on in our head. So we also want to have that physical reminder to make sure that we're always kind of walking in the shoes of our ideal client. And as I talked about a little bit, it's for business to business companies, it's going to be a little different because we want to look at the organization as well as the individuals. Whereas if we're talking about from a consumer facing organization or business, it's really going to be about what does that consumer look like for us. And so that does raise the question, and it's something I get asked a lot, am I only going to have one ideal client profile? And the reality is probably not. Most businesses are going to have somewhere between 2 and 3. One of those may be the company, and then it may be those key players within the company. And sometimes it varies because companies do structure themselves a little bit differently. So for example, I work with nonprofit consultants. So when we did their ideal client profiles, we described what the ideal nonprofit looked like, as well as there's 2 key positions, the director as well as the person in charge of raising funds that would work with my clients. And so they could be kind of an either or. And so we created profiles for both of those folks because it's 2 key players that we could look to connect with. So if there's multiple people within the organization. With consumers, there may be slightly different variations. So it may be that they vary by geography, and we'll talk a little bit more about those characteristics. Or if you have a slightly different service offerings, the ideal client for one might shift a little. You do want a fair amount of overlap if you do have multiple profiles, because what you don't want to be doing is trying to customize services to specific segments, because that's where you're going to drive yourself a little crazy. That's a little too specialized. And so for instance, in my company, we have 3 main ideal clients and 3 main profiles. I'm showing one of my favorite clients. So when I said that exercise earlier, who always pops into my mind is a company called Bug and Weed Mart. They're located here in the Phoenix area. Been in business actually for nearly 40 years now. This logo is a little bit old, and they are a small chain of do-it-yourself pest control stores. So for us, one of the characteristics about Bug and Weed Mart is they are a multi-location business. They have 5 storefronts. That is one of our characteristics, and one of our segments is multi-location businesses, because they have some very specific criteria, some very specific things that need to happen to properly market multi-location businesses online. And that's something, if you don't do it well, you can screw it up really fast. And I see a lot of that. And so there's just some best practices that a lot of marketing agencies don't use. And so it's something we do really well. So multi-location businesses is one of our segments. We also work very heavily in health and wellness, so medical practices, as well as a little bit more on the natural side of that, so chiropractors and naturopaths. And what they share in common with our multi-location businesses is that they also have multiple locations in most instances. So most of our practitioners have 2 or 3 offices, and that's very common, particularly for physicians. They may see often patients mainly at one location most days of the week, and then they have a satellite office. Again, that presents some very specific challenges and criteria that shares with those multi-location businesses, but a little bit more specific, and it's in that health and wellness segment. And our third segment is with professional services. So a lot of consultants, as well as CPAs and people offering professional services, insurance folks. Those are key segments. And there is a tie-in between that and our medical, as well as in the terms that there's a heavy education component to the business. And this is all part of the criteria. I'll go into a little bit more detail. So you can see, even though we have the 3 segments, there's a lot of similarities, so they're not super different. And the services we offer are hit those 3 segments, and hit them in slightly different ways, but we don't need to offer more services to be able to serve those 3 segments. It's the same couple of services hitting those segments. So bring to mind your favorite client right now. Bring that person to mind. I've got mine in mind. I'm thinking about Bug and Weed Mart. This is our ideal client profile worksheet. And so this is, when completed, your final, this is the end result of this process we're going through right now. And so what you want to fill in on this, and this first one is looking at the company. So I'm going to start with our business to business folks. We want to start by describing what's our ideal client company look like. And we want to use demographic descriptors. So those are things for a business like revenue, number of employees, years in business. For individuals, that can be household income, that can be age, that can be number of years that they've been on the job. Their professional experience can play into that. There are quite a few different demographic, race, ethnicity, location plays into that as well. Geography. For some businesses, it's very easy to work anywhere virtually, and so geography may not be a limited factor. For other businesses, it's very hard. I have a client that builds museum displays. That is very difficult to ship across the country and install, and it's very difficult to find craftsmen who do it as well as he do. So he focuses on our local Phoenix market because he's able to deliver and install himself here locally. And so that's something to consider as well. So those are all criteria that you're going to look at. So your next step in this process, before we start filling the sheet in at all, is you're going to take that ideal client name, that favorite client that you wrote down in the middle of your piece of paper, and just start brainstorming, start writing down some characteristics that you would use to describe that client. So that can be the annual revenue if we're talking about a business. That can be the number of employees, and that's an important factor for business to business, because depending on the size of your company and your offerings, some services are going to be better suited to smaller companies and some might be better suited to larger. For us, we know that once a company gets above that 25 employee mark, they're just a little bigger. They need a level of service because we are a virtual agency. That's just not a good fit for us. And we know that under 2, they're just not ready to outsource yet. Usually when it's a solopreneur in the business, they're doing everything themselves and they're just not in a great place to be able to outsource that marketing. Years in business, that can be a huge factor because that tells you where they're at in that life cycle, that maturity cycle, and if they're, again, ready to outsource and they've really kind of got their stuff figured out. As well as so what we're going to do is once you brainstorm out all these characteristics, just write them out at this point in time, jot down what that looks like. In fact, if you want to, go ahead and just pause this video and spend 1 to 2 minutes just writing out as much of that kind of detailed description. And if you find yourself stuck with this, again, go back to that mental picture we have of who your favorite client is. Or if you've got an actual picture of that client, pull their website up, pull them up, be looking at them, and write down and start describing. Start with describing their business, and then we also want to start describing that individual, because what we're going to do with this is we're going to take that and we're going to start writing that into a narrative, and that's what you see in that identity section that just pops up there. We're going to take all those kind of keywords and those separate thoughts, and we're going to start writing that into a little bit more cohesive narrative. On the business side, another thing you want to jot down as you're jotting down your ideas, as you're brainstorming this, is who are the key players, because that is an important thing to think about. Who within the company is the right person for you to connect with, the right decision maker that would be able to partake of your product or service. So you can see here as we start to fill this in, we actually put a picture of the client, or in this case, because it's an organization, because we want to have a real visual. Again, we don't want this to be just a mental picture. It needs to be a physical picture. So we literally want a physical picture that describes visually as well as in words what this client looks like. So for us, as I start thinking about what those key characteristics are, it's that they have multiple locations. It's that they see customers on site. So that's where one of the things we do with are those local actual listings, those directories like Google and Yelp and map services. It's very important if people are coming to your location that they can easily find it. And so that's why a business that sees their customers on site is a great fit for us, because we do a really good job of making it dead simple for people to find you, as well as they value customer education. And so again, that goes back to those 3 segments we talk about. Bug and Weed Mart is the epitome of all of those. So they are a client we started working with a few years back, about 5 years now. And they've been in business, as I said, for 30 some years at that point in time, and had never had a digital marketing presence or a website, and incredibly successful. And it was quite interesting, because as I was sitting there talking with the owner, Jim, the first time, and chatting about this website and what he wanted to do with it, he was interrupted several times as people were walking in the door to browse the wares, but then he would come out and he would have a actually fairly in-depth conversation walking them through. And I thought, what a great experience. And so that's one of the things that makes Bug and Weed Mart unique, because their competitors, like the big box or online, can be more convenient and can be less expensive. But what people don't get is they don't get that that education and the how to use the product properly to ensure that it works. And so that's one of the things I knew from sitting there that day that we wanted to communicate. And that goes into that idea of that they really value that customer education component. And so they've built their entire store business around that. So that's one of the factors we look at. And that's why we like working with consultants and people in the professional services field, because a lot of that, the value in those services also come from the education and the knowledge that you provide to your customers. And we help those folks to be able to communicate that digitally. So now let's look at what the individual profile looks like. So for business to business, we profile out the business. Now we need to look at who those key players are that we listed at, and we need to start describing those as people. For our business to consumer folks, you're going to jump right to this step. So you can skip that whole first slide, but you're going to do the same thing. Write the name of that favorite client down in the center of your paper and start writing down the characteristics you just used to describe them. So that's going to be things like age. That's going to be things like experience. Some people may be more comfortable working with less experienced folks because they're less set in their ways, so they're more open to suggestions and recommendations. Some people may want people that are more experienced in their jobs, because they know that they don't have to do as much education. So that's why we start looking at experience in jobs. It can be, like I said, race. It can be gender. It can be family life. So are you married? Are you single? That's a big part that we want to look at, because what we want to do is we really want to create a mental as well as a word picture of what this person looks like, a narrative describing them, including putting a name in there. So you'll see I very jokingly put I declined decision maker along with their title. If you're business to business, you want to put the title, because that's the title we look for within the organization. If you're consumer, it's just the name. Here's an example of one that I borrowed from our workbook, which is a sample persona. Greg, the general contractor. You'll see in his identity field, we say Greg is a college graduate who is married with 2 kids, lives in the suburbs, and drives an SUV. He's very involved with his local community and works long hours. It doesn't leave much time to hang out with his family. So how we get to that identity is once you've done your brainstorming, so you've got your favorite client's name in the middle of the sheet of paper, and you've gone through and spent your 2 minutes brainstorming all the ways, all the things you would use to describe that, you want to start putting those together into a cohesive story and tell that story about who that ideal client is. And that's what you're going to write in that identity field, is that story describing that client. And so not just what their work life looks like, but also their personal life, particularly if you're a consumer-facing company. A lot of consumer decisions are around our personal life, so that's going to be a key piece. And you'll shift your focus a little bit depending on what you are offering and how that fits within that spectrum. Once you've gotten that narrative, that story written out, we're going to move on to exploring the challenges. And what that means is now that we begin to really create a very rich picture of what this person looks like, we need to understand how our business fits into that rich life that we've created. And so that comes down to their frustrations, their challenges, and their motivations. So we want to map those items out, because that helps us then to start fit that piece of our zone of genius, our services, what we do really well, make sure that they fit properly in with our clients' ideal clients' needs, and that there is a match there. And if not, we can make some adjustments before we go too far along in this process. And frustrations and motivations really kind of play into each other. So this is something that you probably want to work on, these two columns here in your profile concurrently, moving between challenges and motivation, versus just trying to knock them all out in one fell swoop, because they really do kind of start to play into each other. And you'll see at my end example, I'm actually including a real ideal client profile that we created for a client of ours. You'll see how those two play in together and how they play off of each other. So frustrations, we want to describe those things that are challenging to our clients. So if we step back to our example of Greg here, the general contractor, we know some of his challenges are that he is very busy, because he works long hours and he doesn't have much time to hang out for his family. So if the service or product we're offering can alleviate that, that's a challenge we want to write down, because we know we have the solution to that. And that's where we're going to start looking in terms of marketing. You go back to these challenges. And so as you create your marketing copy and your marketing message, you write the copy that will be the solutions that address these challenges. So that's where you start to tie that into the actual execution. And that ensures a much more effective marketing message, because you're speaking to your ideal clients' true pain points, versus sort of just putting some kind of message and open out there and hoping that it'll appeal, because you've gotten into their head, you walked a mile in their shoes, so to speak, and you're clear about that. Greg is also very involved in his local community, which I'm guessing is a little bit at odds with his working his long hours. So he probably doesn't have as much time to be as involved in the community to do the philanthropic work that he would want to. And so that may be a solution. If that's a solution you offer, you make it easier for people to be able to support the organizations in the community that they care about. That would be a challenge you would write down, that he is very community oriented, but is not able to put feels guilty because he's not able to put in the resources he'd like. The motivations, those are going to go a little deeper, and that's really about what is your ideal client's passion, what drives them. And that's our pretty yellow Mustang here. What gets them out of the bed in the morning? Why do they choose the career that they do? If they have, if they're married, if they have a family, why did they choose that? Are those their drivers? So Greg's a great example. We see that he likes spending time with his family, that they're very important to him. So one of his drivers may be his wife and kids, and being able to provide for them and provide a good life. And so that would be one of his motivators that we would want to fill in there. And that's where you're going to start filling those in, right in those challenges and motivations. And those can be more bullet point. They don't need to be as narrative. I would let that kind of tell you how it needs to be. Sometimes it writes itself nicely into a narrative, particularly if their challenges are very close and related to one another. It may end up being more just sort of one challenge, but it could also be bullet points if there's multiple challenge. Same thing with the motivations. So this one's very free form, but kind of put it in the format that makes the most sense, and bullet points may be the easiest if you're having trouble with the getting it all to flow together. So this is a real ideal client profile we created for our client TK Valente. They're the client I mentioned earlier that builds amazing display cases and exhibits for museums. And so one of their key players that they want to connect with, one of their entrees into that hospitality and museum market, is an interior designer. And so one of the things when we worked through this process that we talked about is it's very important that the designer is open-minded. So in this case, we're looking for somebody who's a little bit less experienced, because a more experienced designer is a little bit more set in their way and not as open to when things aren't successful. So I'm just going to read this through you, and then I'll call out some points to you. So Dana is an interior designer specializing in commercial spaces. She has an interior design degree and has been working in the field long enough to be experienced, but not set in her ways. Though she has a creative vision, she also understands that a space must function and stand up to wear. She's highly aesthetic, but also practical. She's married with kids. For her, balance is a must because she's juggling career and family. She's fun and adventurous. She isn't afraid to take a risk. And why that narrative is so important is because you'll notice we actually have some of our challenges in there already. So we had already kind of started exploring some of those challenges and some of those motivations. So Dana's biggest challenge is that she struggles with translating her inspiration into something practical. And I can tell you firsthand experience as someone who is creative, this is something I struggle with. I get a vision in my head. I'm talking to a client. We've got this great idea, and getting it out on paper, or in our case, onto the screen, doesn't always work that way. And in particularly where we're talking about where you're building an actual physical thing, and Dana's not building it herself. She's got a vision in her head, but she's got to be able to communicate that to her craftsman, who's then going to be able to take that and translate that into the real world. And sometimes we understand that what we creatively envision isn't physically possible. And so she needs a craftsman who's going to be willing to collaborate with her and take that idea and make it work and make the changes that are necessary without railroading her. So you'll notice under her motivators, we say Dana thrives on creative collaboration, so needs someone who will work with her and not for her. And what that means is that kind of goes back to that same challenge. She wants to execute this vision, but she also needs somebody who's going to collaborate and help her get something that's going to be sturdy and stable and architecturally sound. She pushes the space to realize its full potential while balancing the need to stay on budget and timeline. So that's something where again, a lot of particularly museums don't have huge budgets, so they may have a grand vision, but then it's how do those dollars, how are you able to take those dollars and actually translate? So we know that's going to be a key concern for her as well. And then she needs reliable vendors who are able to realize her vision. Anybody who's ever worked with a craftsman knows that it's hard to find people who show up on time and do their work. So knowing that those are her challenges, then in Chris's marketing messaging, we actually address those specific concerns. We talk about how his process, and we describe how he takes them, that helps them take that vision in their head and realize it in a physical way. We talk about how he can work within their budget and how he gets projects finished on time and how he returns calls within 24 hours. And so all those things, addressing those concerns, those are all key messages on the website. So when Dana finds him online, she can read those messages, and we've already addressed those concerns before she's ever even voiced them. So the motivations, balance is an important part of Dana's life as she is balancing her career, family, and form and function. So we know that's one of those things that she's looking for balance. So when we're looking at how we talk to her about things, we want to make sure that we don't come in with really extreme off-the-wall messages, because that's going to offset somebody who's craving balance. We want to make sure we come in very even tempered. And she's motivated by aesthetics. She wants to make her world more beautiful and create unique projects. And so those are words that we want to use. We want to talk about unique. We want to talk about impact and making a difference in our marketing materials, because we know that's going to appeal to our ideal client. And they're going to read that and know, they're going to feel like we're talking directly to her, and she's going to be much more likely to sign. So that's where you start to see that profitability comes in, because your sales process becomes a lot easier, because we've addressed a lot of those sales objections up front already. We've already addressed the challenges and concerns in our marketing, because we've talked right about how we do things differently. And we've also created a message in such a way that's going to appeal to the things that are most passionate, most important to me. So I feel like you're already speaking my language and you get me. And that's where those challenges and motivators come to play when we actually start executing this. And so this is what your completed profile should look like. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we use this in every day. But before we do that, I want to hit our fourth step, because this is an important piece. We don't need to spend a ton of time on it, and it's something that you can do very informally, but we do need to make sure that what we've come up with our client profiles are on point, particularly if you're doing it yourself. If you're working with a marketing professional, we're pretty savvy at this and we're pretty good at this. But if you're working on your own, I would definitely recommend doing some interviews. So running it by a couple of your existing clients, particularly that favorite client. Take them out to lunch, take them out to coffee, say, hey, I'd like to prick your brain, and talk to them about what their biggest challenge, ask them what their biggest challenges are, ask them what motivates them, what gets them excited, why they get up in the morning, and record those answers and compare next to your profile. If it's a match, you've done your work the right way, you've hit that nail on your head and you're ready to move on to the next. If they don't quite match up, take what they've told you, update your client profile, and actually use that information. So interviews can actually help you in the beginning of this process as well. If you find yourself struggling to really put your finger on what their challenges or motivations are, reach out, give that favorite client a call and ask them that question. But certainly after the fact, run it by them. Also share these profiles with other folks, other key players in your office, and get their feedback on it, because they interact with the customer as well. They may have a slightly different perspective. They may say, great, this is right on. I've got the mental picture. I know exactly who you're talking about, or not. And that is one of the keys with the ideal client profile, with this final document. And what's really important about this, you know you've done it right. If you're able to stand up and read this to somebody who's fresh to it, so somebody in a referral group or a leads group, or somebody in your company, and they say, a light bulb goes on, they say, oh, you're talking about so-and-so, or I've got to introduce you to Joe Blow, you know you've done the right job with this, because that's how detailed these profiles need to be. They need to be that light bulb trigger of, this is exactly who I'm looking for, and so specific that I'm able to then name somebody I know who meets those criteria. Obviously not everybody's going to know somebody, but particularly in referrals teams, or leads groups, it's a very useful tool if you're not getting the referrals that you want. I'll talk a little bit more about how you can use that to make sure that the folks in your group are introducing you to the right people. But let's finish out this research segment. You can also do surveys, so that can go a little bit more wide. So instead of that one-to-one validation, if you have a pretty large customer list, or you feel like you've got a good pool of ideal customers already on your list, go ahead and do a survey. So use a Survey Monkey. You can do an old school paper survey, email that out. It can be as simple as, what's your biggest challenge? Text box, write it in. What motivates you? Why are you passionate? And do write an answer. So you can keep it very simple, or you can get a little bit more clever with that. If you want to really go in on a survey, that's something you may want to hire a marketing professional to help you craft those questions if you want to go a little bit more in depth, or if you're exploring a new market and so you're talking to folks maybe you don't have a relationship with already, you want to make sure you ask those questions the right way. And that goes into this idea of doing market research. There's some really great tools out there. Info Group USA is one that is excellent for doing the demographic research that helps you to create these ideal client profiles, and really understanding the size of a market, so that it's one of the tools you can use to alleviate the fear of, there may not be enough for me to make a living. If you know you want to focus on a certain type of medical practice, this database, you can actually go in and you can say, show me all of the podiatrists in Gilbert, Arizona that make this much money per year, and the Info Group USA database will show you a list of those actual folks. So it's also a great tool in terms of if you do want to do some a little bit more cold direct marketing, you can use it to actually create a list of prospective clients as well. The great thing about Info Group USA is, well, it is a paid tool and can be very expensive. If you have a library card, you can access it for free. Most libraries offer it as part of their online resources, and so all you need is an active library card, and you can generally log in and access a database like Info Group or something similar to do that kind of research and put that list together and sort of validate against that. So now that you've got that ideal client profile, you've got this physical picture, it's really easy to take that and put it on the shelf. And that would be a big mistake. And that's something, just like our business plan, we fill it out, we do the exercise, okay, great, I'm on to the next 1,000 tasks I have, and we sort of stick it away and we forget about it. Your ideal client profiles need to be a living document. It needs to be something that does update, because it will shift and change over time. Let's face it, people's challenges and motivations change over time. So at the very least, that part's going to, but it may be as your business changes that who you work with changes as well. So it needs to be revisited and make sure it's still current, but you also need to make sure you're actually using it. And that comes into that part of, okay, well, I've got this really cool thing, but what do I actually do with it? I just spent an hour on this whole process, and now what? Your ideal client profiles need to be the core of everything you do in your marketing. And so it really comes back to this principle of, you must begin with your audience in mind. And your client profiles are the way to do that. So anytime you start working on a marketing campaign, or you start marketing an email blast, or you start an advertisement, or the example I love, because it makes it very easy decision on how you spend your money and what services you sign up for. You get some well-meaning ad rep walking into the office, they're representing a publication, and we just know we've got 10,000 subscribers, you do a great fit of even just 1% of those 10,000 people call you, you're going to have a huge number of business and you're going to be so successful. We've all heard that sales pitch. Many of us have unfortunately been sucked into that, and in a lot of cases with disappointing results. And then we'll blame the media, and we'll blame the publication, we'll blame the salesperson. But really, what it comes back down to is it's not that they sold you a bad product; it's just that it wasn't the right product. And so that's where you need to take these ideal client profiles, and in that scenario, you ask them, well, what are the demographics of your readership? Where are they located? What's their age? What's their income level? And you start looking at if those demographics match with your ideal client profile. So you pull that back off the shelf, or ideally you've got it stuck on the wall where you're looking at it every day. You take a look at that as they tell you what their readership looks like, and you see if it's a match. And if it is, great, sign on that dotted line, you're ready to go. But if it's not, if they're completely different fields, you know right then it's not the right fit for your business, and you can very easily say no. So the ideal client profiles are a great decision tool in your business because it can help you get to the very quickly if something's going to work for you or not. If it is not a vehicle that appeals and is used by your ideal audience, it is not worth spending your marketing dollars on because it's not going to hit the right people. And it goes back to this idea of the buyer journey. And this is a very old marketing principle that's been around for a long time. And that's really looking at how your customer moves through the stages. So it goes from, the simple version is know, like, trust. So part of it, you can look at it from the buyer's perspective, which is, I know I have a problem. I'm going to do research to find what solutions are out there and what's available. And then I'm going to make a decision, which is that buy purchase. However you break up your buyer funnel, you're going to tailor your marketing. You're going to look at, and that's where your challenges come into play. You use that to create the marketing pieces to address the concerns at the various stages of that profile. So for instance, we go back to Greg the contractor. He's got 2 kids, so he's definitely going to be thinking about saving for college and college costs. And so at some point he's going to be looking for how to pay for college, or how do I save money for college. And so that would be a top of the funnel kind of thing. We know he's just addressing a problem. So we might put some content out there on the web that addresses that challenge. So that's where we start building our marketing content around those challenges specifically, because that's how we get them into the top of the funnel. As well as the motivations and some of those challenges that are more around objections, or I've had a bad experience in the past. So our Dana designer, where she's maybe worked with contractors who are not very good at communication or returning her calls, and that's a concern for her, we can address that up front through the website. And so that makes for a faster close. So that kind of messaging addresses the bottom of the funnel. But every stage of that funnel, that's the important piece of this, needs to jive with whatever you're doing in that stage to speak to your prospective customer, or to bring them closer to becoming a customer, needs to go back to addressing those challenges and motivations, and then it becomes apparent. It actually makes then determining what those pieces are much easier, because you can look at what those challenges are and say, oh, well, for Greg, let's just create I've got a really great one sheet that I hand out that explains, it gives tips for paying for college. Let's put that out on our website. So it makes it very easy in terms of figuring out what you should do with your marketing. So not just where to market, but what kind of content and what sort of messaging you put in there. And I talked a little bit about messaging earlier. So it really should apply to every stage of that funnel and be part of every marketing decision you use. And that is why the ideal client profile is such a cornerstone part of a marketing foundation. And without it, you will not have successful marketing, because at that point, you're just throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks. But when you really walk in the shoes and have very good clarity about your ideal client and how it is you help them, your marketing message comes from that and feels very natural. And it's just they're attracted to you, you're attracted to them. And that's why we call this attracting your ideal client, because it's just that perfect match. I thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found this informational and are able to walk through this process. Like I said, you will be able to download the worksheet and follow right along. However, we do offer one-on-one consulting where we can help you. As you see, we do ideal client profiles. I'd be more than happy to assist with that. So feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you may have, as well as if you would like to engage our services to help you do these profiles and help you build that into a marketing plan. We'd be happy to do that with you. You've got my email as well as website and phone number on there. So feel free to contact me however you are most comfortable. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.